All right, so we are live. Thank you all so much for tuning in to tonight's discussion. Today, I have Dr. Grady McMurtry on. Yeah, Dr. McMurtry is a good guy. I like listening to his stuff, and yeah. So, Dr. McMurtry, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, sir. It's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you as well. Just for anyone who doesn't know who you are, Doctor, just give us a little quick, basically review of who you are.
Well, the president of Creation Worldview Ministries is available on the web at creationworldview.org. I was an evolutionist growing up. I earned 2 science degrees as an evolutionist, but at the age of 27 became a Christian in a search for truth. Went on to receive 2 doctorates and to found Creation Worldview Ministries. I've been teaching on creation both biblically and scientifically for 45 years. We support a biblical inerrancy, 6-day literal creation, approximately a little over 6,000 years ago. Since I have noticed the older I get, the older the universe gets.
I invited you to come on tonight to talk about the Noahic flood. We're going to discuss that right now. Um, Tell us really quickly, what do you think about the Noahic flood? What do you think the Bible tells us about the Noahic flood? What do you think that the evidence points to? Uh, the model of the Noahic flood.
Well, first of all, of course, it's a very long subject the way you phrased it, but I absolutely believe in the Noahic flood, a complete, total flood of the entire earth. It is described in various places in the Bible. It is described, of course, in Flood of the Earth. The Genesis account says that the water was at least 21 and a half feet above the highest piece of land existing prior to the flood. That's not the mountains that exist today, but it's the hills and mountains that existed prior to the flood. Psalm 104, starting at verse 5, gives us the chronology of the flood. And in verse 6, it says the waters were standing above the mountains, which certainly is not the description of a local flood. And again in 2 Peter, Peter uses the Greek word cataclysmed to talk about the earth being flooded with water, that the entire globe was cataclysmically flooded and destroyed. And so the biblical references certainly talk about a complete, total worldwide flood occurring 1,656 years after creation. The Bible's very specific about that and puts the flood at about the year 2350 BC, give or take a little. Now, the physical evidence for the flood is absolutely undeniable. Now, I will talk about my website at creationworldview.org. We have a complete bookstore. We have tons of free articles, some free videos. But there is a video that we produced called The Waters Cleaved. And the reason for the title is because that's what it says in Genesis chapter 7, that the waters cleaved at the beginning of the flood. And after the waters cleaved, then it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And what it says there is to cleave means to come to a knife edge, and that the waters knifed through from below. That would be the conceptual translation, that the waters knifed through from below. And this speaks of the waters that God created on day 2, the waters below. That God spoke the earth into existence on day 1. On day 2, he separates the very top surface, and as I put it, I suggest the word eggshell, because the earth is slightly egg-shaped. And on day 2, he creates an eggshell that's 10 miles thick, a layer of water 1 mile deep below, and then the rest of the earth below that. And of course, there's waters on the surface from day 1 on day 2, and that's waters above. And then on day 3, he causes the dry land to rise up out of the water. And so the term that we use, Pangea, is actually a biblical concept, because on day 3, that's exactly what God creates. Later, 1,656 years later, the waters that he placed below on day 2 are the waters that will knife through from below and flood the earth, a mile of water coming up from below. Now, many people have a problem with the word mountain. In various languages, various cultures, and so forth, the word mountain has slightly different significances in terms of elevation, but basically, hill and mountain are separated by elevation. Now, in the English language, we talk about a mountain being 1,000 feet high or higher above the local area. A hill would be less than 1,000. And what the Bible tells us is that the hills and mountains that existed before the flood were all less than 1 mile high, so that the mountains could be 1,000, 2,000, 3, 4, even 5,000 feet high, but able to be covered with 1 mile of water.
Standing for Truth, the guy who we were talking about earlier, asked in the chat if you believe in the hydroplate theory or catastrophic plate tectonics is a better explanation for the flood.
Well, I think the biblical description of flood fits much better with the hydroplate theory.
Okay, so just for anyone who doesn't know, do you think you can maybe explain what the hydroplate theory is?
Just in a very quick way, the concept is that the Earth was created as described, and I just did a little sequence of it on days 1, 2, and 3. And at the time of the flood, the water's not through from below. This breaks the eggshell up into big pieces. We call them continents, but effectively they're big boats because they're floating on a layer of water. And just as even a child can push a boat away from the dock as long as the boat's floating on water and do it very quickly, once the eggshell we have from day 2 is broken apart, it can move very, very quickly because it's sliding on a layer of water. That's the hydro, the water part. The plates referring pieces, the fragments with the continents, can then move very, very quickly sideways in various directions, and the water comes out from below. Now, again, thinking of a boat, when the water goes up, the boat goes down. If you punch a hole in the bottom of a boat, the water goes up, the boat goes down. In the same way, when the waters came out from inside the earth at the time of the flood, these continents are moving very quickly sideways, and they're also sinking because the water's coming out from below. And so as the continents move sideways, in literally a matter of months, they have separated to basically where they are today. They're locking down into the position that they are basically today, and the water is then on top, which floods the earth. And it's a very quick review, but that's the concepts of hydroplate.
When I talk about the Noahic flood a lot, I like to talk about geology and paleontology because that's where I focus a ton. And do you mind getting into some geology and paleontology a little bit? But what I like to point out is that there are huge, massive fossil graveyards throughout the world. Not many of them are in North America. And if you look in the fossil record, we see a lot of the dinosaur fossils that are found. The matrix around them is mixed with volcanic ash and mudstone. So, do you have any thoughts on paleontology and geology that you want to cover real quickly?
Well, there's a lot that could be said. And remember, it's not so much volcanic ash as it is sedimentary rock.
Right.
You said mudstone. There's all different kinds of sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock is deposited by water, whether it's limestone, shale, slate, as you mentioned, mudstone. It doesn't matter. But we only find fossils inside of sedimentary rock. The first thing that should tell you is that means that we've had rapid burial of all these materials in a worldwide flood. After all, that's the only mechanism that would cause this situation to happen. This cannot be slow and gradual processes over long periods of time. If animals died on the surface, and of course evolutionists believe they were then buried in order to cause the fossils, well, the truth of the matter is they would have been rotten, they would have been eaten, scavenged, but we often find them totally pristine. Not always, but often. And we often find the skeletons disarticulated. Now, this is what happens when you have soft-bodied creatures like you, dinosaurs, cows, that die in a flood. The torrents tear the body apart into pieces. The flesh is eaten or rots away, but the bones are buried. And when they're buried, you have the perfect conditions for fossilization. You have rapid burial, anaerobic decomposition, no oxygen, and they remain undisturbed. Think about it. What do we have on the Earth? Well, on the dry land surface of the Earth, 70% of the Earth is water surface, but 30% we have dry land today. But at the time of the creation, it was 40% dry land and 60% water surface. So you have to remember there's a difference here. And during the flood, trillions of plants, animals, and even a few remnants of humans were buried in wet mud layers during the flood. That's exactly what we find. I describe it this way. We find sedimentary rock layers covering the Earth, full of trillions of dead plants and animals that all drowned. That speaks of a worldwide flood. It cannot be slow and gradual, deposition, because if that was true, the creatures would have been exposed. And again, we'd have bacterial decay, we'd have scavenging, they'd be gone. Now, other things in the geological record we have, such as there's only 4,500 years worth of mud at the mouth of the world's great rivers, speaking of a worldwide flood occurring approximately 4,500 years ago. We have polystrate fossils, which is my favorite kind of fossil. Remember that the layers in the fossil record can be 1 millimeter thick. As a matter of fact, we could literally say that all fossils except bacteria are polystrate fossils. But most often they're tree trunks. They can be bones, they can be skeletons, but usually they're tree trunks and roots. That's the most common. For an example, at Joggins, Nova Scotia, we have 2,500 foot thick deposition covering supposedly 20 different time zones on the geologic timescale according to the evolutionists. And yet the entire half a mile is connected not by one, but by many roots and tree trunks, connecting all the layers into one deposit at one time. That speaks of a worldwide flood.
Right, so you brought up the polystrate fossils right there, which I think are extremely interesting. And a lot of people will point to like the brachiopods and the other shelled organisms that have lived during the paleontologists and the uniformitarianists will say that lived during the Devonian and during the Cambrian and all these different periods of time. But when I use that argument, like the brachiopods on the top of Mount Everest and on the top of these mountains, right? They'll say like, uh, basically, brachiopods are not clams. See, when I make the argument, I say, well, how did they get up there? And they're still in the closed position. They say, well, brachiopods aren't clams. They're anatomically different. I'm not sure if you have anything to say on that. That's sort of like a question, like, are brachiopods and clams the same thing? Or are they pretty much the same?
Well, they're two different sea creatures, but I think you said something that's very important. They're closed. Clams
Right.
are
Yep.
closed. Now, two things. Number one, we find fossil clams in every single layer of the fossil record. That's very important. Number two, I challenge people. When was the last time you saw a fossil clam that was open? You see, one could literally describe the fossil record as simply clams, because sea creatures are the vast majority of all fossils. And we find not only brachiopods, but again, clams and mussels and oysters and the like. But when we find them, they're closed. What does that tell you? They were buried alive, and the weight of the burial material prevented them from opening. Because when a clam or an oyster or a mussel dies, the flesh inside, of course, no longer holds the shell together. The shell opens up. Birds typically, for instance, or bacteria, eat the inside. The two pieces, if it is a bivalve, separate, and you usually find two pieces on the shore. But when you find fossil clams, they're closed by the millions and millions and millions. And that tells you they were buried alive without the opportunity to open up. And of course, we find similar kinds of things with the burial of dinosaur eggs. I mean, there's all kinds of things that prove that this is a rapid burial. Even finding things such as a female protecting her nest,
Right.
buried with her eggs, an oviraptor. But everything that we find in the fossil record speaks of rapid burial. And again, we find coal, we find polystrate tree trunks, we find coal, oil, natural gas between layers of sedimentary rock. Now, first of all, that tells you that everything there was buried in water-carried material. Number two, the gas deposits tell us that because we still find them under high pressure, they must be young, or they would already have leaked through the sandstone materials. It tells us that we had a tremendous worldwide flood, because let's go to Colorado, Utah, Wyoming. We have coal layers there of pure anthracite coal, 200, 300 foot thick. Let's think about it. To get anthracite coal, now you have lignites, You have bituminous coals, you have anthracite coal. Anthracite's the hardest coal, bestest coal, has the highest BTU content, etc. Now, to get 200 feet of anthracite coal or 300 foot thick layer of anthracite coal, you would have to have layers that were 2,000 foot thick, 3,000 foot thick, with enough mud on top of them to compress them down to 200, 300 feet. Because that's how you get anthracite. You have to compress them 10 to 1 to get anthracite coal. Now, that tells you that there was literally miles deep of wet mud layers with buried plant materials in tremendous quantities all over the world, caused only by one event. That's a worldwide flood. To me, and I love the Grand Canyon. I'm originally from the West myself. But evolutionists will claim that there's 500 million years of slow and gradual accumulation in the layers exposed to the Grand Canyon. And it's a magnificent place. I mean, anybody goes there, you see hundreds and hundreds of sedimentary layers, different colors, very beautiful. And the Grand Canyon's great because it's right there in front of you in a local area. But what they don't tell you is that there's 160 million years out of the 500 missing. There's only 340 supposedly represented there to begin with. The second thing is that they're not in the perfect order that evolutionists claim they are in the textbooks. As I point out, the geological time scale or the geological time record as illustrated in the textbooks of layers of different types with different creatures getting more and more complex as we go uphill, so to speak, simply doesn't exist in the ground. It exists in the textbooks and the minds of those that believe in evolution. But I can show you clear pictures of the Grand Canyon, no doctrine whatsoever, where in fact we see layers that are interlaced like this, that this layer and this layer, but then it's this layer, then it's that layer, then it's this layer, then it's that layer, going back and forth. And you see in some places tremendous folding.
Right.
One of my favorite presentations, though I don't get to show it very often because people don't generally like to spend an hour looking at folded rock layers, is to show them folded rock layers from all over the world. You can't believe some of the folding, and yet it is so obvious when you start looking for it. But we see layers that literally were laid down flat by water because that's what water does. It lays the layers down flat. But in places we see them turned at 90 degrees without any distortion, without any trace of them moving. So that means that they had to be turned as a unit. But in other places we see waves, of folded wet mud layers. Now, think about that for a second. You can't bend rock. Hard rock will break, but you can bend mud while it's still wet. And so what we see all over the world in these folded rock layer formations, and some of them that there are hairpin turns, just up and boom, right back down again. What we see there is wet mud layers laid down flat by water initially. But then because of the movement of the continents, we see compression folding. And in some cases, it's hairpins. We see whole block folding and so forth. And here in the United States, I can tell you where you can just drive on interstates and see these things from the car. There's a great one, for instance, over the hill this way, but the layers go this way. Out near Denver, Colorado, there's a place where you're driving through a road cut. The layers are like this, straight up and down. Just a long section, just straight up and down. That cannot be the way they were laid down originally by water. That means they had to be folded. And again, this speaks of a worldwide flood with continental movements.
Right, and there's so much that we cannot cover in just a single hour. But also, if you look in the fossil record, you see virtually no erosion between the layers. If you go to the Grand Canyon, like we brought up earlier, if you go to the Grand Canyon, you examine each of the layers, there's extremely little a bit of erosion. There's hardly any.
Well, in many places, there's none at all.
Exactly.
One of the things about the Grand Canyon is you literally see two layers meeting perfectly flat. Now, I mentioned there's places where they're interlaced too, but there are many places where they are perfectly one flat against one flat. Now, let's think about, as a scientist, the two most important questions are, and this is the same thing is true of Bible study, what's there and what's not there. And so what is there? Well, we see these wet mud layers full of creatures that have perished by drowning. Sometimes we see them perfect contacts with no dust in between. I mean, not even dust in between. Sometimes we find them folded. But what's not there? Well, what's not there is we don't have any soil horizons. We don't have any V-shaped erosion marks. We don't have any root holes. We don't have any animal holes in these layers, proving that they were laid down rapidly all at one time while they were still wet, folded by tectonic forces of movement, compression and folding. Then they dried out into hard rock, and that's how we see what we see today.
Right, and the fact you brought up also a very interesting point that we see virtually no, like, if you look at the fossil record through a uniformitarian perspective, you see each layer and you say, well, each of these layers were laid down by a different flood, one flood upon another flood upon another flood upon another flood, just separate floods over different periods of time. However, when you look at it, it's not at all compatible with the evidence. I mean, we brought up there's virtually no erosion, and in some places no erosion at all. But what Dr. McMurtry just brought up is that they don't even have like burrows where animals burrowed in. I mean, you probably have a yard, folks, and you probably get like groundhogs or chipmunks in the yard, and they'll leave huge holes down in the dirt. Why don't we see that in the fossil record? Maybe because the whole place was wet and one layer upon another layer upon another layer was all laid down by just one flood.
If each layer had been exposed by separate floods, so each layer would have been exposed for a certain amount of time before the next flood supposedly laid a layer down on top of it.
Right.
Why don't we find the soil horizons? Because we should find some of the material eroded. Why are there no V-shaped erosion marks? Because if a layer was exposed, water would have, from rain and so forth, cut V-shaped erosion marks. And if each layer was laid down one at a time, then the next layer would have filled in the V-shaped erosion mark with mud and dried out and been preserved. But we don't see the V-shaped erosion marks. And again, we don't see the root holes or the animal holes that we would expect the activity if each layer was slowly, gradually, one at a time with exposure in between. And we have sedimentary lab experiments at the University of Colorado and Colorado State, excuse me, and at a sedimentation lab near Paris that has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that all layers are formed at the same time and merely extend in the direction of water flow. And so that the layer on the top is the same age as the layer on the bottom, and that these are not separate flood events. That in moving water, layers automatically form based upon the size of the material in the water, but extend in the direction of water flow. Well, yeah, let's talk about, again, the things that we find. We find all phylum of plants and animals beginning at the same time. Now, not all the creatures are represented all the way back, but all the phylum are. All the phylum start at the same time. Well, that tells you that they were created at the same time, that they did not evolve slowly and gradually in a tree-like branching process. Also, of course, we find things such as flesh. We find soft tissues, even in fossils supposedly as old as 500 million years old. Now, I've got an extensive article on this on my website at creationworldview.org. And again, these articles are free to read. And they're all written at a popular level, except for one section that's clearly marked as technical. But we find soft flesh materials in dinosaurs. We find them in armored fish. We find them even in tube worms that are supposed to be 500 million years old. We have found liquid dinosaur blood. We have found liquids of squids and octopus ink. We find all these things that totally and utterly contradict evolutionary time frames. Remember that when we find dinosaur flesh, and we find it supposedly in dinosaurs that are 60 million years old, 120 million years old, 200 million supposed years old. When we find it, they say, oh, there must be some miraculous method by which these materials were preserved, but that is obviously not true. Iron won't do it, or any of the other things that they suggest. What it shows you is, first of all, they only died a few thousand years ago in a worldwide flood. But think with me, if you have ever been to a home where maybe a grandmother used to can goods, as we called it, but often they were in jars, bell jars, cur jars, and you see somebody who has done the canning of vegetable materials, but in glass jars. If you use them within a year or so, they're fine. But if you've ever seen any of these jars on a shelf that were not used for 20 years, you look through the glass and you say to yourself, I'm not going to eat that. Because even without bacteria, what happens? Molecular bonds break over time. The material disintegrates. It would be impossible for dinosaur flesh or other soft materials to last for hundreds of millions of years because the molecular bonds would have broken down. We've even found snippets, and I mean small snippets, but we've even found small snippets of DNA. Again, DNA is a molecule that breaks down really quite quickly in nature. Basically, DNA molecule of a human being would be unrecognizable after the molecular bonds have been breaking down over even 10,000 years. So it's impossible for dinosaur DNA to be 100 million years old and still be recognizable. And so there's all kinds of different arguments. And then there's, of course, the human artifacts that we have found in deep layers. Some of the layers predating the dinosaurs according to evolutionary time frames.
All right, great. Excellent points there. Yeah, when you brought up the soft tissue, very common objection that you'll hear amongst the evolutionist camp and Darwinist camp. They'll say, well, when Mary Schweitzer found her soft tissue in 2005, she had to do a bunch of tests on it and make it soft. So it wasn't actually soft. She had to make it soft. Like she had to dip it in acid 6 or 7 times, and until it could get soft. But like you brought up, within a year or so, it's not going to be good anymore. It's just going to dry up, and it's not going to, it's going to be useless. Right.
Well, again, the molecular bonds, even if you preserve it and encase it in a fossilizing pocket where we don't have bacterial activity, the molecules are still going to break down. Now, Mary Schweitzer is the first and preeminent person when it comes to having found soft tissues. But many of the things that I cite on my website have absolutely nothing to do with Mary Schweitzer, found by others. Again, even color pigments in the eye of an armored fish. Again, I mentioned the tube worms that are supposed to be 500 million years old, and yet the material itself was still soft to the touch. These things could not possibly be true if they were that old. They'd be again unrecognizable. The molecular bonds would have simply broken apart, and we'd go from molecules to atoms.
Right. It would just be like a glob. It would just be very unrecognizable. You can't even identify it. Right. That's extremely interesting, and I'll have to look into that a little bit more because.
Read my article. The citations are there. People that discovered it, the reports that were written on it, and so forth. But it's accepted by evolutionists that these findings are real. But of course, they have to tell their fairy tale for how they could exist that long. The first fairy tale Mary Schweitzer told was about the iron deposits that were with it. But that's been debunked. And it doesn't explain all the others.
Right. So the next thing that I want to talk about, Doctor, we're going to have to end the stream very soon, but I wanted to get some questions in from the chat before we end this. But one last thing, I like to talk about the paleontology and geology of things, like I said before. And I talked a little bit about the fossilized graveyards of the dinosaurs. A very interesting one that I found is the Howie Quarry. The Howie Quarry in Wyoming. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, right?
Well, the Howie Quarry, and of course the General Hells Creek Formation, and there are fossil graveyards in the West, as there are fossil graveyards in other parts of the world. But what we find are millions and millions of dinosaur pieces, most of them disarticulated. That's why we call them, fossil graveyards. Um, yes, on occasion we find a few articulated, but usually they're disarticulated, which again speaks of millions of animals all dying by the drowning process, being disarticulated in turbulent flood waters, then being buried in wet mud layers, which dried out into hard rock, and the materials were fossilized. But many people do not understand the fossilization process either. They think that these are bones that have turned to stone, and that's not true. The fact of the matter is, most of the bone is still there. What has happened is the soft tissue inside the cells has been replaced with mineral material, but the cell walls, such as the lignin with wood in fossil wood, petrified wood, or in the case of the bones of creatures, the soft material inside has dried out, creating a void in the cell, but being calcium, the cell walls are hard. And the material is then filled with mineral water, which then turns to crystalline form and makes it seem that the bone has turned to rock, makes it much heavier than it would have been originally. It feels like rock. But in fact, the vast majority of the cell walls are still there. And it's particularly true with petrified wood. I mean, that's the easiest one. How many times have you gone into a store that was selling petrified wood and you've seen a beautiful piece where they've sliced through and then polished it up? You can still see the rays, you can still see the cell walls in the fossilized wood piece, correct?
Right.
That's because the cell wall material wasn't replaced by the rock or mineral materials, but was merely filled in after the soft materials have been desiccated.
Right, and that's called permineralization, I believe, right?
Permineralization.
Yep. Yeah. So paleontologists for a long time used to believe that a bone would just be in the dirt, and it would be encapsulated in the dirt, and then water would seep in, replace the molecules from the bone, and just fill it in with minerals, right? Which we know is not the case anymore.
And today we know how to make fossils. I mean, literally make fossils, and we can make fossilized wood in a few hours.
Right, and there's actually a cool experiment. If anyone wants to do it, you can actually just cut up. You can actually just take a sponge and put it in, I believe it's sand, and put salt water. Water it with salt water, and over time, over a few weeks, a matter of weeks or even less, it'll just turn to like a solid. I'm not sure if it would be fossilized, but I'm pretty sure it's petrified or permineralized. I'm not sure if you've heard of that experiment.
Well, similar experiments have been done in other places, and there's a place in one of my videos on why I believe in young creation, where I show a mineral, natural mineral spring formation in England, in Yorkshire, and the mineral water overflows a lip, an edge, flows down, and as the water evaporates, it leaves behind the mineral, so you have sort of a stone waterfall. But then people have come along and they put hooks and a wire along the bottom of the stone waterfall, and they come by and they hook things up there and come back 4 months later and they're fossilized. And in the photo I show that there were 23 teddy bears being fossilized at one time, along with hats and other things. But fossilization actually occurs very quickly. And in a case like the mineral spring, it only took 4 months for a teddy bear to fossilize.
Right.
But under the right conditions, it can be much faster. I show a piece of coiled rope from the Czech Republic that fossilized in only 2 weeks. But then I show finding by an evolutionary believing paleontologist back in the 1980s in Brazil at the Santana Formation. And in there he observed, and I commend him, I genuinely commend him. He didn't allow his religion and evolution to oversee a good scientific observation. He looked at fossil fish, looked at the condition of the fish, which include fossil stomachs, muscles, erect scales, and he concluded by the physical evidence, without allowing evolution theory to get in his way, evolutionary religion to get in his way, that the fish had fossilized in 5 hours or less. And then he concluded that, in fact, the fish had probably fossilized instantaneously, that it had died from the process of being fossilized.
Yeah, so that obviously proves like that fossilization does not take
Doesn't take millions
it
of
doesn't take
years.
millions of years. It just
If
takes in a
if
matter of
if you can die from it, it's not a slow and gradual process.
right. That'd be a better way to summarize it. Summarize it. It's not. Some people will say, well, it doesn't. And you're right. It doesn't take millions of years, but it does take significant amount of time. No, not really.
No, and we
uh,
can make fossils in the lab in a few hours, but here in nature, an evolutionist looked at the physical evidence and said that the creature had died from the process of fossilization. That is an incredible statement.
I would just want to ask you something really quickly because I've been thinking about this a lot. The global warming issue. This was sort of an issue last year. It's with Greta Thunberg and all these other key players, but global warming. I mean, I doubt that the world is
It's not.
warming.
It's not.
Um,
It's not true. It's not true.
right,
It's absolutely not true.
right.
As a matter of fact, the Earth has been cooling for roughly the last 20 years. At the moment, we're in a deep solar minimum. Two things that you need to keep in mind, in addition to the fact that the Earth is losing more heat every day than it gets from the sun. So there's a slow, gradual loss of heat every day. But volcanoes cool the Earth always. And volcanoes never heat the Earth. They always cool the Earth by shading. And sunspot activity. Now, we know scientifically why this happens, but when sunspot activity is actively going on, the Earth is warming slightly. When the sunspot activity goes down and at zero, which it's very close to at the moment, the Earth is cooling. Now, this has to do with the sun's magnetic field protecting or not protecting the Earth from various forms of radiation. We don't have the time to go into it. But these are the things that cause the Earth to cool and warm. Humans cannot heat the Earth. We cannot cool the Earth. I always find it very interesting that evolutionists like to say that they're the ones who believe in science, when in fact they believe in anti-science. Creationists believe in real science, and the scientific evidence is overwhelming. Now, I do have a long article on my website you can read for free showing that the Earth is not warming, it's cooling at this time.
Right, that's very interesting. So basically, the sun basically goes through like cycles of its history, where it experiences sunspots, and if there's virtually no sunspots, then we get a lot less heat, and hence the Earth cools. Right? Is that basically good?
Well, the sun goes through four different specific cycles, and of course, it's doing them all at the same time. So there are points at which, because of how the cycles work, that they might reinforce each other, having a greater effect. And again, the cycles could hit in such a way that one cycle would tend to negate the other and kind of flatten it out. And so it's very complex. But the sun is not the only thing. Again, we have to look at volcanic activity. We have to take a look at solar activity as well. So these things all play a part. Now, during the Little Ice Age, that started about 1250 to 1300 and lasted until 1895. We had a period from roughly 1650 to about 1700, roughly 50 years, with almost no sunspots. And that was the bottom of the early part of the Little Ice Age. But then in 1800 to 1830, we had two very low sunspot cycles. At the same time, we had a big volcano out in Indonesia. In 1815, Tambora erupted. And because of the sunspot activity being very low and this monster of a volcano erupting right on the equator, in 1816, we had the year without summer because the volcano was shading the Earth and there were no sunspots of any significance. And what happened? It was a perfect storm. And that was the bottom at the end of the Little Ice Age. And from that point, after 1830, the Earth and sunspot activity started to come back up. The Earth started to get a little warmer. But we only came out of the Little Ice Age about 1895. I have a chapter in my book and a very long article on the website if anybody wants to read it.
Right, that's very interesting. And the reason why I bring up the global warming issue is because I like listening to a guy named Dr. Kurt Weiss. I'm not sure if you've heard of him.
Of course, he's another creation scientist.
Right, yeah. And I was watching one of his videos, and he said, well, there's a whole global warming issue that's going on right now, but let's say it is warming. The Earth was obviously a lot warmer before the flood, prior to the flood. And there were no glaciers prior to the flood. And so basically what's happening now with global warming is that the Earth is going back to its pre-flood state. The Earth has to recover from the flood.
Well,
You
let's be careful there because the Earth has been significantly warmer 3 times after the flood than it is today. The small elevated heat at the moment of what's called the modern warm period is more than today, and that's prior to industrialization. The medieval warm period lasted from about 850 to 1250. That's long before the Industrial Revolution. The time of the Roman warm period was much warmer on the Earth than today. But again, that's certainly pre-industrial revolution. And the same thing with the Minoan, which goes back to roughly the time of Moses and Joshua in human history. But 3 times it's been much warmer than today and had nothing to do with human activity.
Right, right, and it's just an interesting thought that I thought that he brought up. Obviously, I still doubt that the Earth is warming, and what you brought up is extremely compelling evidence that the Earth is not warming. In fact, it's the opposite.
At this time.
At this time, yeah. Right? So
since 1895, we've had approximately 5 times of slight heating and slight cooling that was still warmer than the Little Ice Age. But our slight warming and cooling that's going on right now is still far less than the warming that occurred at these 3 other events that are all pre-industrial revolution. And so humans can't heat the Earth, we can't cool the Earth. If you're a Bible-believing Christian, there's about 3 dozen verses in the Bible where God says he's in charge of the weather, we can't change it. But when we take a look at the science of it, now Galileo discovered sunspots, so we've only had sunspot activity that's been measurable since just after 1600. But we do have human history. We have evidence of how warm the Earth was or how cool the Earth was. For instance, the Nile River was something that the Egyptians kept yearly records on. It was very important for them, agriculturally speaking. We have the written records of when the crops were grown at different places on the Earth. Well, certain crops can only grow within certain temperature ranges. For example, 2,000 years ago, when the Romans were in what they call Britain, at Hadrian's Wall, which is roughly the border with Scotland, they were still able to grow grapes and produce wine. We know where the wheat was being grown, how far north, how far south on the Earth. That tells us the temperature. And we have, of course, art. When you take a look at the art, say, of the Renaissance, it's a sunny day outside the window. When you take a look at the art of the 2 dark ages that occurred between the Roman warm period going away and the medieval warm period starting, there were 2 deep, dark, cold periods. When you look out the window, you see gray clouds, cold temperatures, etc. And it was a very cold time. We have the written histories to go along with it. So we can tell what the temperatures were even without a modern thermometer.
We're almost out of time here, but before we close it down, Doc, I just want to get to some of the comments and some of the questions. Is that okay with you?
Sure.
All right.
Absolutely.
All right. Excellent. So, Doctor, the first question you have is from a guy named Heath Hendricks. He asks, what is the difference between the shellfish found on Mount Everest that were closed instead of open? Brother Matt Powell mentioned that once, and I'm guessing he's asking, like, what's the major difference between clams today and the clams that are found on Mount Everest in the closed position?
Well, first of all, the important thing is they're closed, and secondly, that they're at the highest spot on Earth, which shows that this is material that was pushed up from a time when the shellfish were buried, and they had to be buried below seawater. But of course, seawater levels were higher during the flood, particularly because of what's called tidal tsunamis. But in terms of the species, I couldn't tell you. I've never dug into the species that we find, but we do find shellfish at the top of Mount Everest. That's an important thing. But it tells us that this is marine material buried in a flood, pushed up through tectonic activity. Think about what I had said earlier. At the time of the flood, the waters knifed through from below, and God had created a layer of water 1 mile deep below. And there were shallow seas on the surface starting with day 1. On day 2, God creates the layer of water below. On day 3, he separates the water on the surface from the dry land. That's Pangea. And the seas that existed on day 3 after the dry land comes up were roughly 1 mile deep. Now, let's define the difference between a sea and an ocean. The basic difference is not the size, it's the depth. So seas are up to 1 mile deep and oceans are 2 to 4 miles deep. I said that there was a mile. How can I say that? If you'll take a look, now, for instance, in our DVD on the Waters Cleaved, I showed the actual maps of the ocean floor. If you look at the ocean floor without water, you can look from India to Australia along the south slope of Indonesia. You will see two continental shelves. One is a mile deep, then it breaks off and goes another mile deep. The same is true in the Pacific, that from the Gulf of Alaska to Kamchatka along the south slope of the Aleutian Islands, there are two continental shelves. One's a mile deep, then it breaks off and goes another mile deep. There's also two continental shelves from Kamchatka all the way past Japan, the Philippines, China, and Vietnam. Now, this shows that when a mile of water comes up from below, remember what I said, if the water goes up, the boat must go down. So that as the water came up from below, it can no longer support what would be the bottom of the seas, and they therefore drop down. And now you have a mile of water added on top. And when the sea floors drop a mile, they break off, leaving these double continental shelves. So the physical evidence is there, but that's not the only piece of physical evidence. For instance, in the Pacific, we find hundreds of what are called guyos, Guyots, guyos. Guyos are submerged islands. They are flat-topped. They're not pointy volcanic like Fiji or the Hawaiian Islands. They're flat-topped. And what's really interesting is they're all roughly 1 mile below sea level to the flat top, and then the mountains continue down to the ocean floor, and they have sandy beaches on the top of the edges going around, and they have dead coral reefs going around the edges below what would have been sea level to begin with, proving that these were islands from creation to the flood for 1,656 years. When the ocean's floors dropped a mile, when a mile of water comes up from beneath, they drop down a mile, taking these islands down and now having approximately 1 mile of water on top. So we have two pieces of excellent information to prove that the water that came up from below was roughly 1 mile thick.
Oh, wow. Okay, so, and my question would be, like, would that be equally around the world, or would that be, like, pockets underneath the crust?
Well, basically, the ocean floors, the sea floors that were in existence, basically all of them dropped roughly 1 mile, different in certain little places, of course. But the generality is that the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, they were seas to begin with, and their floors dropped at least 1 mile at the time of the flood when a mile of water came out below, and that left the double continental shelves. And the Guyos that we find in the Pacific, again, were islands at creation. So when God created the dry land on day 3, most of it was together in what we call Pangea, but there were some islands, and these Guyos are the physical proof that there were these some islands at the time of creation, living in warm tropical seas with active coral reefs, because this kind of coral only grows within 300 feet of the ocean surface. There are two kinds of coral. One requires light because of photosynthesis and only grows within 300 feet of the surface. That's the kind of coral most people think about. The Great Barrier Reef, for instance, in Australia. But there is a kind of coral called hard coral. Now, the kind of coral most people think about, that's porous, soft. It's often, sometimes at least, used for jewelry. It's considered a semi-precious stone. But the kind of coral that we find around these Guyos is the kind that only grows within 300 feet of the surface, proving that, again, now they're a mile below because they dropped down a mile, being covered with a mile of water.
So the next question comes from Standing for Truth. Evolutionists say isochron dating proves an old Earth. Is that true? And what is the best way to debunk it?
Well, first of all, isochrons prove nothing. What you have to remember about isochrons is if they were in fact accurate, their axes would go through the 0 point on the graph, and they don't. And for instance, when you take a look at isochron dating that's been done on the surface of the moon with two different radioactive elements, you get two different isochrons. But isochrons are meaningless. They're useless, really, because they don't go through the 0 point on the graph.
All right, so the next question comes from Ramat. He asks, does Grady like the Ashley phosphate beds of South Carolina as evidence for the flood? So I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but the Ashley phosphate beds in South Carolina are basically like you would expect to find dinosaur fossils in those layers. And you also find, along with dinosaurs, you also find human remains, such as like in the 1800s, they found a femur bone that belonged to a modern human, Homo sapien. They found a ton of arrowheads there, and guess what? The scientists that went over there to research that, guess what they did? They dumped They dumped those artifacts into the river nearby. They just flushed it into the river, and they said that it was a geologic unconformity and that had no geologic rights. What do you think about that?
They were anomalies that we could not allow people to know about.
Right, right,
That's really what it is. It's called hide the evidence.
right.
Destroy the evidence. Don't let anybody know about it. Well, first of all, we have phosphate beds here in Florida. Our phosphate mines, although they're running out at the moment, but we've been producing phosphate for many, many years here in Florida. And phosphate beds are always full of fossils. I mean, we have found giant sloth, mammoths, all kinds of stuff. I mean, the Peace River, if you ever want to go on a fossil float hunting for fossils, that's a good place to find them. And sometimes we even find them semi-articulated. Uh, but the fact of the matter is that what we see here is, again, the story and testament of a flood. That these phosphate beds were formed very, very rapidly as layers during a worldwide flood. If you go to the Bahamas, there's actually places around the Bahamas where you could get on a scuba suit, go down a few feet, really not that far, and literally in a 1 hour dive, watch the sedimentation growing towards you.
Oh wow.
The chemical reaction that forms these things is occurring in the water right in front of you. Now, again, as I mentioned too, the OOP art. You mentioned arrowheads and so forth. What we call OOP art, out of place, OOP. We find this OOP art all over the world. We find an iron pot in an anthracite layer, supposedly more than 300 million years old, or we find a clay-fired figurine out in Idaho, supposedly 12 million years old. It doesn't matter where you go in the world. We find all kinds of stuff like this. But this speaks to the fact that this is material that was made prior to the flood and was incorporated in the wet mud layers that were then incorporated as fossilized layers. We have found a fossilized hammer, wood hammer, but the handle's still wood. It's not even permineralized, supposedly about 440 million years old. We find all kinds of things. In the 1940s, during World War II, we found a bell about the size of what we'll call a dinner bell in West Virginia in bituminous coals that were supposed to be more than 300 million years old, but was incorporated because of the flood in plant materials that then became coal encasing the bell, and we were fortunate enough to find it. I mentioned I'm from the West, out in California, and I grew up on the campus of Cal Berkeley. Now, during the California Gold Rush, which is 1850 to 1890 by designation, in an area that I know very well as a child growing up, in Ptolemy County, we found over 300 man-made stone tools, but these layers, according to the evolutionists, were 9 to 55 million years old. That's why we call them out of place according to the evolutionary time frame. But again, this just simply shows you, here we have over 300 man-made stone tools that were incorporated in mud layers, meaning they had to be made prior to the flood, and these are on display at the University of California, Berkeley. This is not something fabricated by creationists. This is supported by evolutionists at the highest level.
Right. So the next question we have here from the chat is from Standing for Truth as well. Do we know where the flood boundary is?
There's a lot of conjecture about that with creationists, and so nobody can be absolutely definitive, and I won't be. I will say that if you read our scientific literature, if you read our scientific journals, you will get some differences of opinion there. But we can delineate many layers would be during the rising water period of the flood, and that other layers would be during the recessive period of the flood. The exact boundary, people have different opinions.
Another question from Ramat. He says, I heard Dr. McMurtry say that he likes polystrate fossils. But what is your favorite subject or topic in all young Earth creationism?
First of all, there's the biblical aspects of creation science, and there's the scientific aspects of creation science. When it comes to the Bible, I did a video on the creationist view of marriage. My personal opinion is it's the single most important message that we have using creation science and the Bible. My favorite subject is the flood because it's a massive subject. It allows us to get into everything from geology to paleontology to archaeology. It's one that I've spent literally decades studying and talking about. And so my presentation on The Waters Cleaved is my favorite creation science presentation on the science side. And the creationist view of marriage is my favorite message on the biblical side.
This comes from John Wick. He asks, do retroviruses and junk DNA prove evolution?
Well, no, because there's no such thing as junk DNA to begin with. That's a term that was used by evolutionists for about 20 years, and then they stopped using it because they now know there is no such thing as junk DNA.
Exactly.
And retroviruses or pseudogenes, depending upon the terminology you want to use, they're not proof for evolution. What they are very clever creation things because God put them there. We now know that pseudogenes are in fact active. In some cases, they are used to kind of like decoys to prevent damage to real genes. In other cases, they're actually coding. So the big statement you need to remember in the close of this program is this: there is absolutely no such thing as junk DNA. It doesn't exist. This is not an accumulation of previous DNA used in our evolutionary process that's no longer needed. We do have DNA that has been destroyed in function because of entropy, what's called genetic entropy. But in terms of the genome, there's no such thing as junk DNA.
And really quickly before we shut down, you mentioned genetic entropy at the end. Paraphrase it really quickly. What is genetic entropy?
Well, you have to remember that genetics is simple. I can teach a child, I could teach a 10-year-old child enough about genetics to defeat an evolutionist. In genetics, we simply copy the previously existing information, passing it on into the next generation in new combinations, but never in new information. When you copy, you can only copy things perfectly or imperfectly, but that will never lead to an increase in intelligence or complexity by random chance. So over time, what happens is you get mistakes in copying the previously existing information, and these mistakes then accumulate. Right now, we are accumulating about 60 permanent mistakes per generation in the human genome. We are decaying, and we are decaying fast. We know because of the Human Genome Project that was completed in April 2003 that we are losing between 1 and 2% of our genetic information per generation. That's roughly the 60 permanent errors per generation. And that this has been going on for 6,000 years. The wonder of it all is, and the miracle, that we are even here, because this process would ultimately cause us to cease to exist.
Right, and that'll pretty much wrap up for today's discussion, everyone. We couldn't get into every single little nitty-gritty detail. We did what we could in this short 1-hour discussion, Doctor, but you have any final thoughts before we close this out?
Well, my final thoughts are that we can prove scientifically that evolution is not true, that things do not get bigger, better, faster, smarter by random chance, that mutations always and ultimately head downhill. Now, there may be a minor benefit from a mutation in one sense of a word, but it is never generally beneficial. And therefore, mutations in the long term go downhill regardless. That proves that we started with a perfect created genome in plants, in animals, in people, and that because of human sin, we have had the decay process that began 6,000 years ago and has continued to get worse and worse over time. That puts us in the position we're in right now, which is one scientific argument, not the only one, that the Lord's coming back soon. Because if he doesn't come back soon, we wouldn't be here to greet him.
Right. And so the ultimate message that we're trying to get through here, guys, is that if you're not a Christian, please believe on Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved in thy house. And just believe on Lord Jesus Christ and be saved today, guys.